I always had a lot of respect for Brock because he chose to move to Saskatchewan. Which, if you've ever been to Saskatchewan, you'd have a pretty good grasp on what that sort of decision means. Working a show in Saskatoon or Regina always meant something a little special. Obviously, when I was the champion, I got to tour a lot of pretty important places. You'd work in a New York, a London, or the Berlin. Which, going out on the town with the boys was always pretty fun. Especially in any place in Europe, because of how over I was anywhere I went, we had just giant crowds of people. It was something like the Beatles, with women grabbing at me and wanting to kiss me. It really made the nights out on the town something pretty special, you know. But when we also toured the less fortunate places, it maybe stuck with me more. Whenever we worked in a show in India, or an East German town, or maybe a Manchester, it reminded me a lot of my time on the road in Saskatchewan. Places where you just sort of ponder how people live such a hard life there. Brock was a guy who could have chosen to live in a Malibu, or somewhere real attractive. He had all the money, and the power to do so. Instead, he chose to keep living on the sort of farm. Which I always respected. My dad Stu used to say a worker who chooses to go home after a show will always make the next show. Which is just sort of an old school shooter's way of saying choosing to live simply is always best for the long term. Which wasn't common for a lot of the boys. A lot of guys, when they started making the bigger money, you'd see them buying the big houses, showing up with the premium rental car, staying at the big hotel, you know. I remember seeing a lot of that when I got to WCW. I remember pulling up to the arena with a pretty decent rented Ford Taurus. I'd get to the parking lot and you'd just see all these fancy cars sitting there. Which right away told me the boys were making a lot of money. I remember just standing out there looking around, and watching a Scott Norton pull up in a new Mustang. Just as I sort of saw that, I heard a pretty big engine roar and saw a pretty polished vintage muscle car pull up with Bill Goldberg behind the wheel, wearing a set of headphones and sunglasses. I remember Bill drove the car way too fast, and peeled right up to the loading bay door. He stopped for about 30 seconds and revved the engine as loud as possible to the guys standing around. Then he tried to back it up into a nearby handicap stall, but he had real trouble. He'd throw it into reverse but oversteer, then have Vito go back to straighten it out. Over and over, with the engine almost stalling out. Bill progressively getting more and more blown up. You could see Bill knew how to make the big entrance, but hadn't been trained on the basic driving fundamentals, you know. Finally, after a solid 5 minutes or so, with his car awkwardly backed into a stall with the front end sticking out still by about 4 feet, Bill got out of the car, pulled his gym back out of the back seat and slammed the door. The entire time chewing gum pretty obnoxiously. I stood there with my hands in denim short pocket. I said, "That's a pretty nice ride, Bill." He nodded at me almost as if he didn't really know who I was and walked in. I should have knew right there that Bill Goldberg was a reckless, sloppy piece of shit.